When you stop reaching out, the avoidant starts reaching in. We've all been there. Waiting for a message, checking our phone a little too often, replaying conversations to see where we went wrong. It feels like chasing someone who only seems to pull further away the closer we get. And at some point, we ask ourselves, what if I stop reaching out? What happens then? Here's what happens. You create space, some messages in your mind. They're necessary, but in that space, something powerful starts to shift. See, people with avoidant tendencies aren't emotionally unavailable because they don't care. They're unavailable because closeness feels like pressure. It feels like a loss of control. So when you're always initiating, always showing up, always proving you care, you're inadvertently confirming their fear that intimacy means losing freedom. But when you stop, you interrupt the pattern. You're no longer the source of the pressure. You're no longer the one they can quietly depend on while offering very little in return. And now they're left with the silence, their own silence. And in that quiet, they finally have room to feel something they've been avoiding, the absence of you. That absence, it speaks louder than your presence ever could. It's not manipulation. It's not a game. It's a boundary. And boundaries are attractive because they show self-respect. You're not walking away in anger. You're stepping back in dignity. And here's the beautiful twist. When you stop reaching out, the avoidant, if they truly care, starts reaching in. Not just into their phone to message you, but into themselves. They start asking why they feel the emptiness. And they begin to process their own emotional needs. And only then, only when you've stopped overdoing much, do they start to realize what they're missing. So stop chasing, let the silence speak. And remember, your absence, when rooted in self-worth, is more powerful than presence rooted in insecurity. When someone has an avoidant attachment style, their instinct is to pull away the moment things start to feel emotionally intense. It's not because they lack feelings. In fact, they may feel deeply, but that depth of feeling can overwhelm them. Intimacy, for them, often registers as pressure, a demand they're not sure they can meet. The more someone tries to get closer by calling, texting, asking to talk, the more the avoidant person starts to retreat. Not out of malice, but out of self-protection. It's as if every emotional bid you make feels like another hand pulling them deeper into something they're afraid of drowning in. The mistake many people make is assuming that if they just prove how much they care, if they're patient enough, consistent enough, giving enough, the avoidant will eventually feel safe and come closer. But for avoidance, this kind of closeness often triggers the exact opposite reaction. The more someone shows up, the more they feel the threat of emotional enmeshment, and the more they feel the need to preserve their independence. What feels like love and connection to you can feel like pressure and obligation to them. This is where the dynamic becomes painful. The more you lean in, the more they lean out. You start doing more of the emotional work. You initiate the conversations. You hold space for their fears. You take on the role of the emotional caretaker. And all the while, you're hoping that eventually your effort will be met with reciprocity. But what actually happens is that the avoidant becomes more emotionally complacent. Your effort becomes the new normal, and they come to rely on your pursuit without ever having to risk vulnerability themselves. It's not because they're bad people. They're operating from a deeply ingrained belief system, one that equates closeness with losing control or being consumed by them. Love feels safest when it's at a distance. So when you reach out again and again, hoping to bridge the gap, you're actually confirming their fears. You're reinforcing the idea that connection means surrendering their emotional autonomy. The pattern is subtle, but powerful. You become the source of emotional responsibility in the relationship, while they become increasingly detached, not because they don't feel, but because feeling too much too quickly feels unsafe. That's why chasing never works with someone avoidant. It doesn't soften their defenses, it strengthens them. They don't come closer because they're not yet choosing to. And no amount of effort on your part can make someone ready for a closeness they haven't chosen themselves. When you decide to stop constantly initiating contact, what you're really doing is interrupting a pattern. In relationships where one person is anxiously attached and the other avoidant, there's often an invisible dance that plays out. One reaches, the other retreats. One seeks reassurance, the other guards their independence. This cycle can go on for weeks, months, even years, until someone finally steps back and refuses to keep playing their role. That decision to create space can feel terrifying at first. It can feel like letting go of control, like risking the loss of a connection you've worked so hard to maintain. But what you're actually doing is rebalancing the emotional equation. Avoidant individuals often rely on this pattern without realizing it. They get used to being pursued. They know, consciously or not, that even if they distance themselves, you'll eventually come back around. You'll be the one to apologize, to reach out, to keep the connection going. In that dynamic, they don't have to take emotional risks. They're protected from vulnerability because you're doing the work for both of you. But when you stop reaching out, you break that unspoken agreement. You take your energy out of the pattern. And without your constant effort, the pattern cannot survive. This isn't about playing games. It's about no longer being complicit in a cycle that isn't serving you. When you create space, you're not trying to manipulate the other person into missing you. You're simply refusing to carry the emotional weight on your own. And that space, while uncomfortable, is necessary. It allows both people to actually feel the consequences of their roles. You begin to see how much you are overextending, and the avoidant begins to notice your absence, not because you slammed a door, but because you quietly stopped knocking. In that stillness, clarity emerges. The person who always had emotional breathing room is now confronted with a kind of silence they're not used to. No text to ignore, no calls to deflect, no presence to take for granted. It's in this disruption that real reflection can happen. If they're capable and willing, some will stay distant, confirming they weren't ready. But others will begin to feel the discomfort of disconnection. And for the first time, they may feel a desire, not pressure, to re-engage. This shift doesn't happen when you're filling every space with your presence. It happens in the quiet moments after you've stepped back. That's where real awareness can begin, both for them and for you. When you've been the one always showing up, always reaching out, your presence becomes expected. It's not necessarily appreciated or cherished. It's just assumed. There's comfort in knowing someone is always available, always responsive, always there. But the moment you remove yourself from that role, everything changes. Your absence, when it comes from a place of self-worth rather than punishment, has a weight to it. It causes a shift that can't be ignored, especially by someone who has grown used to emotional distance. What once felt like pressure to them now becomes noticeable quiet. And in that quiet, they start to feel the loss of something they may have never properly acknowledged: your value. You don't have to disappear in anger or slam the door behind you. The absence we're talking about here is not dramatic, it's deliberate. It's rooted in your decision to stop giving energy where it's not being matched. You stop sending the check-in texts. You stop being the first to call. You stop offering emotional safety to someone who hasn't earned access to it. And the moment you do that, something subtle but powerful begins to unfold. That absence becomes a mirror reflecting back the effort or lack of effort that they were contributing all along. This is not about using silence as a tactic or pretending you don't care. It's about reclaiming your emotional space. When you're constantly present for someone who's only half in, you dilute the impact of your presence. You become background noise. But when you step back, your absence becomes an experience. It creates contrast. Suddenly, there's a gap where warmth used to be. There's a pause where validation used to flow. And that gap is not empty, it's full of meaning. It forces the avoidant person to confront what they've been avoiding. That your emotional availability was a gift, not a given. Ironically, the very thing they once resisted, your closeness, is what they may start to crave once it's no longer readily available. But that craving can only emerge in the absence of pressure. Only when you stop trying to be seen do they start to notice what they were blind to. Your absence does what your words, your texts, and your efforts never could. It creates an emotional impact, not by demanding attention, but by removing the certainty of it. In this space, your worth doesn't need to be stated, it's felt. And often that feeling becomes the very thing that awakens them to everything they were too afraid or too distracted to see before. When you stop reaching out, there's an initial void that can feel deeply uncomfortable. Silence sets in not just between you and the other person, but also within yourself. You may feel the urge to break that silence, to explain, to seek reassurance, to try one more time. But if you can resist that impulse, something powerful starts to unfold. The silence becomes a space not of punishment, but of reflection. It's where clarity begins to form. It's where both people are given the opportunity to confront their role in the relationship without distraction, without noise, and without someone else filling the emotional gaps for them. For someone with an anxious attachment style, silence can feel threatening. It can feel like abandonment or rejection. But in truth, it's a chance to reset the nervous system and step out of the chase response that often defines these dynamics. When you're not chasing, you're finally able to hear your own thoughts, to feel your own needs, and to recognize how much energy you've been spending trying to maintain a connection that may not have been meeting you halfway. The quiet offers a moment to come back to yourself, to assess not just how much you miss the other person, but also how much of yourself you've been losing in the process. On the other side, the avoidant person begins to feel the shift as well. They're used to you reaching out, used to your name appearing on their phone, your emotional presence creating stability, your persistence creating security. Without that, there's nothing to hide behind. The space you leave behind isn't just empty. It highlights the absence of their own engagement. And while that might not immediately spark action, it begins to stir something internal. The silence which once felt safe starts to echo. It challenges their comfort zone. It asks questions they've avoided. Why don't I reach out? Why am I not showing up? What am I afraid of? This isn't about proving a point or making someone feel bad. It's about giving both people room to become aware, really aware of how their behaviors are impacting the relationship. And it's often in these reflective spaces where nothing is said that the most important realizations are made. The avoidant may begin to process their fear of closeness, and you may begin to understand the cost of constantly overextending yourself. Real change doesn't happen in noise. It happens in the silence that follows when one person finally steps back and decides to listen, not just to the other, but to themselves. When you decide to step back from constantly reaching out, it's easy to feel like you're doing something wrong, especially if you're someone who has been taught that love means effort, patience, and proving yourself. But there's a critical difference between showing love and abandoning your self-respect. When your efforts are not being met with equal energy, and when you continue to pursue someone who gives you crumbs of attention, your actions slowly shift from genuine connection to self-betrayal. Choosing to step back isn't about punishing the other person. It's about choosing yourself. It's about recognizing that real connection can't exist when only one person is doing the emotional lifting. Often we confuse silence with disconnection and boundaries with rejection. But a boundary is not about keeping others out. It's about keeping yourself intact. When you stop chasing, you're drawing a line that says, I value myself too much to keep proving my worth to someone who isn't meeting me where I am. That's not cruelty, that's strength. It's the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to demand anything because it already knows its value. In many relationships, especially those involving someone avoidant, the energy becomes unbalanced. One person leans in, compensates, reaches, and tries harder, hoping that the other will eventually match their efforts. But that pursuit often reinforces the avoidance belief that they don't need to give more, that closeness will always come to them without effort. When you step out of that pattern, you're not being distant. You're allowing reality to set in. You're creating the opportunity for the other person to choose to step up or to walk away. And either outcome gives you clarity. What makes this powerful is that it comes from a place of peace, not anger. You're not storming off, you're not slamming doors. You're simply no longer willing to engage in a dynamic where your value depends on your effort. You're not asking someone to chase you, you're inviting them to show up of their own will without pressure. That's the difference between manipulation and maturity. You don't need to convince someone to care. When you hold your ground and respect your boundaries, the right person will feel that. And if they care, they will come forward. Not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. In the end, the most attractive energy you can bring to any relationship is self-respect. It's not cold, it's not distant, it's simply knowing your worth without needing to prove it. So when you stop reaching out, you're not giving up on love, you're giving up on begging for it. You're not closing your heart, you're closing the door to patterns that keep you stuck, exhausted, and unseen. This isn't about withholding to get attention, it's about honoring your value enough to stop giving it away for free to someone who isn't ready to meet you. If the avoidant truly cares, your silence will speak volumes. And if don't, then your silence will still serve you by making room for someone who's emotionally available, present, and ready. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Let your absence echo with the dignity of someone who finally chose themselves. Thank you for showing up today. Not just for this message, but for yourself. It takes courage to let go, to stop reaching, to stand still when everything inside you wants to chase. But trust this, you are not losing connection, you are creating clarity. You are not being passive, you are practicing power. The kind that comes from self-respect and emotional maturity. Keep honoring your boundaries. Keep choosing your peace. The right connection will never require you to abandon yourself. Take care and thank you for listening.